You don't fight with honor.
No. He did.
I wonder how highly anticipated this video is, and I guess we're about to find out. We're all in great need of some cheer in this world, and if watching my videos is a way of achieving it, then I'm happy to provide. Henry VII is often left behind in the zeitgeist of Tudor history, even though he can arguably be called the king who brought the Renaissance to England. Personally, I think that the medieval period in England ended with the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry Tudor was a king who acknowledged that the kingdom that he'd taken was exhausted, broken, and wasting money by fighting with itself. He would face a lot of opposition from those who clung to the old ways, but he would prove his supporters' faith in him by making England wealthy, providing access to the riches in the New World, and forging foreign alliances that allowed the kingdom some relative safety as it built itself back up from the Wars of the Roses. This is Henry VII, the first Tudor king.
Original Tudor, founder of the dynasty, the man who closes the walls of the roses. That's right, that's me.
I suppose now is a better time than ever to explain a brief history on the House of Tudor. It was a Welsh house in origin, hailing from Anglesey, formerly the Kingdom of Gwynedd. Before Wales was conquered by the English in the 13th century by Edward Longshanks, Wales was a series of small kingdoms. The word Tudor comes from the first name Tudor Hen, whose ancestors served the Llewellyn kings of old. Then Longshanks conquered Wales, and Tudor Hen would submit to the English king. He took part in a Welsh resistance but submitted once again, and would go on to serve Edward II, and his son went on to serve Edward III. During the rebellion led by Owen Glendower, sorry, it's not Owen Glendower, it's
Owen Glendower, Welsh hero of the hour.
Rhys ap Tudor, Gwilym ap Tudor, and Merdod ap Tudor joined the rebels. Rhys was executed, and the family had much of their assets and influence taken by the crown. Merdod ap Tudor would have a son named Owen. At this point the spelling changed to what we know it as today. Owen Tudor served Henry V during his conquest in Agincourt. It was here that he would meet Henry's queen,
Catherine of Valois. I mean, we don't know.
Following King Henry's death in 1422, the widowed queen would marry Owen in 1428, albeit secretly, and they had two sons, Edmund and Jasper. 9 years later, Catherine died, and he was arrested. King Henry VI pardoned him and received Edmund and Jasper at court. In 1461, following the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, King Edward IV had Owen Tudor beheaded at Hereford. At the time of his grandfather's execution, young Henry Tudor was 4 years old. His father Edmund had married 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort. However, he was captured during a rebellion by Grifford ap Nicholas and left to die of bubonic plague. Margaret barely survived giving birth to him, and giving birth so young made her unable to have any more children. Henry was born on the 28th of January 1457 at Pembroke Castle in South Wales. Jasper Tudor, his uncle, would take on the role of his father. Henry's life was not so much in danger until the early 1470s. The Lancastrians were injured, but not yet defeated, and Edward IV had bigger fish to fry. Henry VI was alive, but in the Tower of London, and his son Edward was in France with his mother, Marguerite Anjou. Henry was taken into his uncle's care at Pembroke Castle, while his mother was remarried to Humphrey Stafford. She would be able to visit him from time to time. Margaret Beaufort, a highly religious person, was certain from an early age that she was called to a higher purpose. She claimed St. Nicholas guided her to marry Edmund Tudor, but very few saw what impact young Henry would have until the most prominent Lancastrian figureheads were killed. Though he was illegitimate through his father's line, the Beauforts had been legitimised by Henry VI. Following the Battle of Towton, Jasper Tudor had to flee England, and the Crown seized his property. Henry was taken into the custody of Lord William Herbert, who planned to marry Henry to his daughter and influence him into becoming a Yorkist. Herbert was given Jasper's earldom of Pembroke, and Henry spent most of his time at Raglan Castle. He enjoyed a good education and learned how to ride and fight. Margaret was present at court, appealing to King Edward to let her son inherit his father's title, Earl of Richmond. In 1469, Herbert brought Henry with him to witness the Battle of Edgecote. This was the only time Henry was on the York side. The Lancastrians were led by supporters of the Earl of Warwick, who would switch sides after a dramatic falling out with King Edward. The Lancastrians were victorious. Herbert was captured along with his brother and taken to Northampton, where they were executed. Henry was returned to the care of Jasper Tudor. Henry VI was restored to power, and young Henry Tudor was presented to him in 1470. The king said Henry was someone both we and our adversaries must yield to, and give over the domain. Margaret Beaufort took the king's words as a prophecy that Henry Tudor was destined to be King of England himself. Edward IV returned from exile in 1471 and swiftly destroyed the Lancastrian restoration. First he defeated Warwick the Kingmaker at the Battle of Barnet, before capturing Queen Marguerite and killing Prince Edward at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Henry VI was later murdered in the Tower of London. By rights, that should have been the end of the Wars of the Roses. Henry was the only remaining Lancastrian figurehead. He would flee with his uncle Jasper, first into North Wales, then later to Brittany. Edward sent troops after them, and Jasper would execute their leader. After a stormy voyage, they landed in Brittany, which was an independent duchy from France at the time. The reigning duke was cousins with Henry's paternal grandmother, Catherine de Valois, and he welcomed the exiled Tudors. Margaret was left behind, and widowed once again. She married High Constable Thomas Stanley, who was close to the crown, and she would serve Queen Elizabeth Woodville at court. She would once again endeavour to plead her son's case. Henry was forced to wait patiently to see if King Edward would pardon him, or if an opportunity would arise for him to gather support to claim the throne for himself. With no Lancastrian enemies, the House of York started to turn on itself, beginning with the execution of George, Duke of Clarence, in 1478. Edward would constantly try to coax the Duke of Brittany into giving up Henry and Jasper, offering 4,000 archers in exchange for them. Then Edward IV died in April 1483, and in a matter of weeks, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized the throne from his nephew, becoming Richard III. Now seemed as good a chance as any for Henry to take the throne. His first attempt came that very same year. The Duke of Buckingham, who had initially helped Richard to the throne, quickly turned on him and led a rebellion with Henry Tudor as its figurehead, although it was more likely that he was trying to get the throne for himself. How many times have I said throne already? However, the rebellion was given away early, and Buckingham rushed to seize the moment, only for the weather to be his downfall. Henry did not throw himself into the fray, and decided to see how things played out. Buckingham failed, and was executed at Salisbury. Richard III, now seen as a tyrant for usurping his nephews and presumably murdering them in the Tower of London, was out for Tudor blood. Henry, having gathered support from English exiles, who initially fled in the 1470s, all were enemies of Richard like Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset, he left Brittany for France. He knew the only way to bring peace to England after taking the throne was to unite York and Lancaster in marriage. He made a declaration at Wren Cathedral that he would marry Edward IV's oldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, when he became king. Margaret Beaufort, while under house arrest and constant scrutiny by Richard, managed to reach Elizabeth Woodville and propose the match, to which Elizabeth agreed. Henry adopted the Red Dragon of Wales as his sigil and touched down on the South Welsh coast on 7th of August 1485, travelling north up the Welsh coast, gaining support along the way, before he crossed the border into Shrewsbury. Richard travelled north to meet him, and both sides came together at Bosworth Field, 15 days after Henry had landed on the British Isles for the first time in 14 years. Richard had 12,000 men, while Henry had 8,000. The deciding factor in the battle was the Stanleys, who had yet to pick a side, and had somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 troops. Sir Thomas was married to Henry's mother, but he was also held in high regard by the House of York, and Richard was holding his son hostage. I've already detailed the Battle of Bosworth Field in my Richard III history video, which is linked in the description. In short, Richard made a fatal mistake of charging towards Henry and getting surrounded by his mercenaries. Henry stepped back and let his men take Richard down. Seeing the tide of battle turn, Stanley declared his men for Tudor and closed in. Richard III went down fighting, and the circlet from his helmet was found on a hedgerow and placed on Henry's head. In the immediate aftermath, Henry declared his reign began on the 21st of August, the day before the battle, making those who fought for Richard traitors. I've also talked about how Henry came to marry Elizabeth of York, which you can find in her video. First, he needed a dispensation from the Pope, but also Henry wanted to establish that he had become king through his own accomplishment, not because he was married to Edward IV's daughter. As such, he did not marry her straight away. He had his own coronation on 30th of October 1485. He invited Elizabeth, her mother and siblings to court, and they were married at last the following year. Elizabeth quickly fell pregnant and she gave birth to their first son Arthur, who was believed to have been prematurely born at 8 months. The nobles who fought for Richard III were either imprisoned in the Tower of London or kept on a tight leash at court. Henry kept his friends close and his enemies closer. Very few were executed outright. Almost immediately after taking the throne, Henry knew the most likely figurehead for a Yorkist resurgence was the 10-year-old Edward, Earl of Warwick. He was kept at the Tower of London initially as the King's ward, but rumour quickly spread that Warwick had been murdered in the Tower as the princes had been, allegedly. So it wasn't long before the Yorkists decided to use this rumour to their advantage. A priest, named Richard Simons, recruited a young boy, known only as Lambert Simnel, and started training him in the ways of the court. He initially tried to pass Simnel off as Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower, only to claim that he was the Earl of Warwick instead. This gained support from the Earl of Lincoln, John de la Pole, who was allowed to live following Bosworth. Lincoln approached Margaret of Burgundy, Edward IV's sister, who financed his endeavour and gave him mercenaries. He met up with Simons and Simnel in Ireland, where the Earl of Kildare also pledged his support. They crowned Simnel in Dublin on the 24th of May, 1487. By then, King Henry was aware of the rebellion and decided to beat them at their own game. Henry had the real Earl of Warwick paraded through the streets of London to prove that he was still alive, and the boy Lincoln and Kildare were promoting was an impostor. This quickly dampened any potential support that the rebels hoped to pick up as they touched down in England and travelled across the Midlands. Henry's army met them at East Stoke in Nottinghamshire, which is not that far from Bosworth Field. On 16th of June 1487, Lincoln was killed in the battle. His brother Suffolk would also try to take the throne, but he was executed by Henry VIII in 1513, and his title went to Charles Brandon. It seems Henry decided that he was not going to appear as a bloodthirsty tyrant. He spared not only Kildare and Simons, but also Lambert Simnel himself, whom he reasoned had had little say and was just used as a pawn. Simnel was sent to work in the royal kitchens, and later became a hawkkeeper, dying sometime in the 1530s. The Earl of Warwick was kept in the Tower still, this time under more scrutiny. It is likely the isolation and fear of what might happen to him affected his mental health. His sister Margaret was married to Sir Richard Pole, a Welsh knight, between 1487 and 1491, but was mostly left unaffected by the new Tudor regime. Just a few years later, a new claimant to the throne arose. This one was supposedly the Duke of York again. But it was the real one this time, we promise. Actually, no it wasn't. It was just some guy named Perkin Warbeck. Warbeck was a Flemish merchant's son who couldn't speak English. Margaret of Burgundy claimed he was her nephew in 1490, and he would go to Ireland the following year, learning English along the way. He would travel around Europe and the British Isles, trying to gain favour. In the meantime, Henry and Elizabeth had more children. Only Margaret, Mary, and Henry, the new Duke of York, would survive infancy. Warbeck tried to invade in 1495, but his army routed and he fled to Scotland. King James IV welcomed him and allowed Warbeck to marry Lady Catherine Gordon. They failed to invade England with a Scottish army, as Ralph Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, beat them back. James decided to cut ties with Warbeck and agreed to a peace treaty with Henry, where James would marry Princess Margaret when she was old enough. Warbeck fled and tried to start a new attack from Cornwall this time. The Cornish had recently been humbled by Henry, following their opposition to tax rises, and he gathered 6,000 supporters. They took Exeter, but Henry's swift approach caused Warbeck to flee to Balliol Abbey for sanctuary. An army came for him and he was handed over to their custody. Henry had Warbeck's allies executed, including William Stanley, his stepfather's younger brother, and the Lord Chamberlain. If history and pop culture has taught us anything, don't trust the Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain is not your friend. Henry tried to treat Warbeck kindly, as he had done with Lambert Simnel. He kept him nearby at court, showing off the fact that Warbeck was a nobody and an impostor. Catherine Gordon, meanwhile, was kept in Queen Elizabeth's household, but the two were kept apart. When Warbeck tried to escape, he was taken to the Tower of London. In 1499, Warbeck and the Earl of Warwick were accused of trying to escape the Tower, charged with treason and sentenced to death. Warbeck was hanged at Tyburn on the 23rd of November. This was to emphasise his common-born status, as only gentry and nobles could have the privilege of being beheaded on Tower Hill. Nobles like the Earl of Warwick, who would lose his head 5 days later. It's possible that Henry had his Privy Council arrange Warwick and Warbeck to be caught in the act, so they could make an excuse to execute them, according to the statutes of the law. Unlike his son, Henry VII actually made sure people were guilty of what they were accused of. Yes, you can call this entrapment. Henry's reasoning to do this was down to his desire for an alliance with the recently united Spanish kingdom. He wanted his son Arthur to marry the Infanta princess, Catherine of Aragon, but Ferdinand and Isabella said they could not agree to the match if Henry was at risk of losing his crown in a York resurgence. Both Warwick and Warbeck had to die to secure this alliance. The 1500s seemed to be off to a good start for Henry. He had an heir and a spare, an upcoming union with Scotland, and he had removed, however reluctantly, the most extreme threats to his throne. Catherine of Aragon arrived on the 2nd of October 1501, and she married Prince Arthur on the 14th of November at St Paul's Cathedral. Henry's sense of security quickly came crashing down when news reached him of Arthur's death in April 1502, either from consumption or sweating sickness. Henry and Elizabeth were told of it early on the 4th of April, 2 days after Arthur's passing. Henry immediately broke down and wept as Elizabeth reassured him that they still had Prince Henry and could have another son. Later she collapsed in grief, and Henry comforted her in kind. The marriage between Henry and Elizabeth, though arranged at first, turned into a genuine loving relationship. Henry VII is one of very few English or even British monarchs who remained faithful to his wife and never took a mistress or sired bastards. The following year, Elizabeth of York was pregnant with her 7th child. She would take to her chambers at the palace complex in the Tower of London. On 2nd of February, she gave birth to a daughter, whom she named after the Dowager Princess, but she only lived 16 days. Elizabeth of York died from childbed fever on 11th of February 1503. Henry was recorded to have been devastated at his wife's death, not letting anyone except his mother near him. Still, there were decisions to be made, especially in regards to the Spanish alliance. He managed to secure peace with Scotland by sending Margaret to marry King James, but Catherine of Aragon was still at court, and her parents were requesting either her return or for her to be married to Prince Henry. For a brief time, Henry proposed the idea of marrying Catherine himself, but this was quickly rejected. Renewing the alliance didn't come any easier when Queen Isabella of Castile died in 1504. She was Queen of Castile in her own right, and the title ought to have gone to Juana, her eldest daughter. Juana and Henry were on good terms with each other. She visited the English court in 1506 with her husband Philip after being caught up in a storm en route to Spain. Later that year she was widowed, and Henry considered taking her as his wife. Thanks to her father's underhanded dealings, she was ousted as queen in 1507, where Ferdinand acted as regent and forced Juana into a convent. The Spanish succession was always going to be a bit of a mess, and it only got worse when the Habsburgs showed up.
It's me!
Though it was common for English monarchs to go to war with France, it was practically a rite of passage at this point. Henry never attacked France in order to conquer it. There was a brief conflict in France in 1492, as he tried to help Brittany remain independent, but France itself was too busy with the Italian wars, and the momentum for a war with England died out on both sides. Nonetheless, Henry sought to protect England by investing in its naval powers, something Henry VIII would increase and Elizabeth I would profit from in 1588. There was some disquiet in Europe, however, that was setting many religious leaders on edge. Over the years, some religious movements rose up to protest the actions of the Roman Catholic Church. The Church responded with attempting to convert them back to their way of thinking, then torturing them, then burning them. In England, a new principle called Lollardy was begun, which denounced the belief of transubstantiation, in which the Eucharist becomes the actual flesh of Christ. Henry V was notorious to have burned many, many Lollards. They also believed that church leaders should not be wealthy, as material goods were a distraction, and they also believed in separation of church and state, and also that the church should focus more on helping people and less on praying and worshipping icons. On the downside, they also believed that women couldn't take part in religious vows because they couldn't contain their lust. Yes, because history has showed us that whenever a sexual scandal happens in any church, it's always the women who are the perpetrators. That was me being sarcastic if you couldn't tell. Lollardy is considered a prototype for Protestantism. Henry VII is known to have had an 80-year-old woman named Joan Boughton burned at the stake at Smithfield for being a Lollard in 1494. Apart from being the one to defeat Richard III and being Henry VIII's father, Henry VII is best known for being a miserly king. If there was one thing that Henry VII would be criticised for, it was for the heavy taxes he placed on the people. Two men, named Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, were the most hated of Henry's tax collectors. In order to distance himself from his father's practices, Henry VIII sentenced both men to death not long after his accession. The Cornish Rebellion of 1497 was caused primarily in opposition to Henry placing new taxes on the Southerners in order to defend themselves against Scotland. Until now, the Northerners were taxed to fight Scotland, and the Southerners were taxed to fight France. Henry was centralising the funds raised and dispersing them where they were needed. The rebels were defeated at the Battle of Deptford Bridge in south-east London. However, Henry may have put heavy taxes onto the people, but he didn't just target the poor. Nobility and gentry were required to pay more, whether they spent much or saved much. By the end of his reign, he had made England into a wealthy country, and then Henry VIII went and spent it all. Still, that's not to say that Henry's thrifty nature didn't affect people. One of the most notable sufferers was the now Dowager Princess of Wales, Catherine of Aragon. She was caught in a state of uncertainty as the Spanish succession conflict went on. Her father would not send her the rest of the dowry until she was married to Prince Henry, and King Henry kept the possibility of marriage hanging over Catherine's head as he expected the rest of the dowry to be paid. Bit by bit, Catherine had to sell her possessions just to buy food for her servants, and her household kept getting shrunk down. So, while Henry managed to literally raise England's fortunes, he did so with corruption and coldness, tarnishing his image in history. The years had not been kind to Henry, which was shown in his deteriorating appearance. In his portraits, he is often shown with a narrow face with long brown hair. By 1509, the 52-year-old king had gone grey and he had grown visibly thin. He would spend a lot of time withdrawn from court life, with only his mother caring for him. His last act was a marriage by proxy between his daughter, the Princess Mary, to Charles Habsburg, the future Spanish Emperor Charles V. Henry had been ill for a few years now. His cause of death has been identified as consumption, which is a slow killer. It gave him time to put his affairs in order. He already had a tomb prepared for him in Westminster Abbey, next to Elizabeth of York. There was discussion as to whether the 17-year-old Prince Henry should have a regent, but it was ultimately decided that he was old enough and capable enough to rule on his own. Some Tudor dramas show the king and the prince having one last meeting before he dies, where he tells his son to marry Catherine on his deathbed. But whether Henry VII told his son to do this isn't a verified fact. On 20th of April, Henry received last rites. The next morning at 11 o'clock he passed away. His son was pronounced Henry VIII several hours later. According to his wishes, he was buried next to his wife in Westminster Abbey. 2 months and 8 days later, Margaret Beaufort would also pass away, her mission to see her son rule England fulfilled. The death of Henry VII was the end of an era of bloodshed, and the start of even more bloodshed. Henry VIII would take the foundations which his father built, and the England he would leave behind would be unrecognisable.
What youth is that of whom you seem to have so tender care?
My liege, it is young Henry, Earl of Richmond.
Come hither, England's hope.
Fellows in arms and my most loving friends, bruised underneath the yoke of tyranny. Thus far into the bowels of the land have we marched on without impediment. And here receive we from our father Stanley lines of fair comfort and encouragement.
If you will outstrip death, go across the seas and live, dear Richmond, from the reach of hell.
Go, my dear nephew, from this slaughterhouse.
Henry Tudor's Shakespearean counterpart is fairly historically accurate. Although he is one of the most significant roles in the Henriad, Henry VI Part 1 and 3 through to Richard III, it is quite small, despite being the victor at the end. The reason for this is because Shakespeare's English history plays, minus King John and Henry VIII, is one big multi-generational story. Henry, who is referenced throughout as Richmond, represents a new generation, bringing peace to a torn and blood-soaked England. But there are other reasons as well. Richmond first appears in Henry VI Part 3 in Act 4, Scene 6. It is a minor, non-speaking role, but Henry VI notices him and prophesies that he will be king one day. If secret powers suggest but truth to my divining thoughts, this pretty lad will prove our country's bliss. His looks are more full of peaceful majesty, his head by nature framed to wear a crown, his hand to wield a sceptre, and himself likely in time to bless a regal throne. Make much of him, my lords, for this is he, must help you more than you are hurt by me. Immediately afterwards news arrives of King Edward's escape from captivity, and everyone has to rush to battle once again, leaving the young Richmond behind. In Richard III, Richmond does not appear until the very end, and his first reference in the text does not come until Act 4, Scene 1, when Elizabeth Woodville bids her son Dorset to join Richmond in exile for his own safety. Throughout the rest of the play, Richmond becomes an increasing threat, which is only amplified as Richard orders the deaths of the princes and murders his wife with the intention of marrying Elizabeth of York. Due to the condensed timeline, Buckingham's rebellion and Richmond's arrival in England are smushed closely together, and Buckingham is executed while Richard is on his way to Bosworth Field. Immediately after, Richmond makes his first appearance in Act 5, Scene 2, where he rallies his men against the tyrant before they make camp for the night. Often when showing Richard III's ghost dream, both Richard and Henry are shown on stage as they sleep the night before the battle. The ghosts of Henry VI, his son, Hastings, Anne, the princes, and Buckingham all curse Richard and bless Henry Tudor. Both men are affected by the dream, but Richmond feels more motivated to win the battle. In the final scene, the two are directed to fight one-on-one, to which Richmond strikes the killing blow. But depending on what adaptation you're watching, it may change. Afterwards, Henry delivers a closing monologue, vowing to bring peace to England and unite York and Lancaster once and for all. England hath long been mad and scarred herself. The brother blindly shed the brother's blood. The father rashly slaughtered his own son. The son compelled been butcher to the sire. All this divided York and Lancaster, divided in their dire division. O let now Richmond and Elizabeth, the true succeeders of each royal house, by God's fair ordinance, conjoin together. And let their heirs, God, if thy will be so, enrich the time to come with smooth-faced peace, with smiling plenty and fair prosperous days. Abate the edge of traitors, gracious Lord, that would reduce these bloody days again, and make poor England weep in streams of blood. Let them not live to taste this land's increase, that would with treason wound this fair land's peace. Now civil wounds are stopped, peace lives again, that she may long live here. God say, Amen. On its own, it delivers a satisfying ending to the Wars of the Roses plays, especially if you happen to watch a property which adapts all four plays. However, Shakespeare had a political reason to boost Henry VII so much. At the time of his writing, especially because these histories came so early in his career, Shakespeare had to have his plays approved by the Master of Revels, and it had to be patriotic and validate the monarch. Elizabeth I, being Henry VII's granddaughter, has her claim to the throne justified as the descendant of a just and peace-loving monarch who saved England from an evil tyrant, hence why Richard III gets so villainised. I'm sure we'd have benefited greatly from Henry VII getting his own play. I would like to have seen it. I bet it would have been based on Perkin Warbeck. Maybe Shakespeare died before he could write one. Interpretations of Richmond in visual media via Shakespeare are often identical, but if you look closer, you can see where people have tried to put their own spin on him. I like the BBC television Shakespeare's idea to give him a Welsh accent. If he didn't gain a French accent from his life in exile, then it is likely he would have sounded Welsh. He also seems a lot brighter visually than the rest of the cast. He is played by Brian Deacon here. Like the rest of the cast, he plays multiple roles, including the Duke of Somerset in Henry VI plays. The Ian McKellen version is my favourite because it sets up Richmond long before he becomes plot relevant. I think this was because A, it is more narratively compelling, and B, McKellen took general audiences into consideration while making it, knowing that a grand majority wouldn't know the full text and expect a proper setup and payoff of each character. Here he is played by Dominic West, appearing briefly throughout the movie so the audience knows who he is. He's even seen dancing with Elizabeth of York in the opening sequence. The two of them are married the night before the battle, and they manipulate the text so Elizabeth actually gets some lines for once. Richard and Henry get their final showdown, but they change it now. So Richard goes out in a literal blaze of glory, but Henry gets some shots in so he can say he struck the killing blow. The fourth wall breaks that followed Richard throughout the movie now passes on to him, as he grins at the audience. It's not so much a triumphant end as a now we follow this guy sort of ending.
Your Not too long in Brittany, Henry Tudor.
Well, I can only beat what you put in front of me, Uncle.
Well, your timing is perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Come in and see him.
I'm a father.
You are not sleeping.
We are beset with enemies on every side. Until wedding bells ring out and Spain becomes our ally, we have neither the funds nor the men to save ourselves. And all of Europe knows it.
I think, hands down, these depictions of Henry are the worst. If any single character represents how bad things got in the Gregory-verse in terms of writing, it's how they massacred my boy. Richard III got terrible character assassination in the form of trying to ship him with his niece.
Ew.
But with Henry Tudor, they sent a Terminator back in time to kill his character at birth. He first appears in The White Queen as a child, played by Rhys Pockney and Oscar Kennedy when Margaret Beaufort comes to visit him. Margaret is cray-cray, to put it nicely. She believes Henry will be king due to a vision she has in the second episode, and she spends the entire series like an obsessive stage mother. She nonetheless adores him and hates that she can't raise him like a proper mother. As a result of their distance, Henry treats her quite formally. He appears again after the time skip in episode 7, now played by Michael Marcus, preparing to return to England as he's been granted leave to return. Then Edward dies and Margaret sees a chance to let the House of York tear itself apart, so Henry can pick off the winner. Margaret is the primary mastermind behind getting her son to England, with Lord Stanley helping out whenever he thinks he can get away with it. Throughout the intrigue, it cuts to Henry every now and then as he waits to make his move. The problem with this, I find, is that Henry does not make much of an impact. Granted, Philippa Gregory's Cousins War series is told from the perspective of the women, but a visual medium ought to take advantage and give Henry more depth. As a result, I don't find him worth rooting for when it comes to Bosworth. I'm actually hoping against hope that Richard is going to win. It's the White Princess where the twaddle really starts. In the big recast, he's played by Jacob Collins-Levy. With Lizzie and her mother scheming and being behind some of the big decisions, and Margaret Beaufort being behind the rest, there is nothing left for Henry to do except go along with whatever his wife or his mother convinces him to do. The biggest biggie of them all is the relationship between Henry and Elizabeth, which is tainted from the start. Because the White Princess begins with Elizabeth of York being in love with her uncle,
Ew.
she isn't too happy at the idea of having to marry the man that killed him. Henry doesn't want to marry Elizabeth either, but he's been too thoroughly whipped by his mother and decides to get Lizzie pregnant to make sure she's fertile before marrying her, thus explaining why Prince Arthur was born at 8 months rather than 9. What a wonderful alternative! Henry is also a massive coward. While the real Henry VII continued on with his northern progress, even after an assassination attempt at York, because he knew fleeing made him look weak, this one goes running back to London with his tail between his legs. Henry and Lizzie warm to each other following Arthur's birth, where they find a common ground over their lack of autonomy, and how their mothers put them where they are today. The two of them curling up together feels more like Stockholm Syndrome on both sides. Henry isn't allowed to have a single decision of his own, even when it comes to fighting his own battles. I understand the desire to have your female leads be more active, even if they didn't have such autonomy or influence in real life. But it should not come at the expense of a character who was known for their intelligence and strategy. And then the Spanish princess comes along, in which Alan will leave the room for us. While his previous counterparts somewhat resembled the Henry VII as shown in his portraits, sometimes even wearing a hat, Elliot Cowan's Henry has really let himself go. Contextually, it's only been 2 years. The love between him and Elizabeth feels more genuine, however, likely because the recast leads help you forget that this relationship started with her being coerced into sleeping with him. She begs Henry not to let Prince Harry marry Catherine of Aragon because of the curse or whatever, and he does spend a decent amount of time mourning his wife. The death scene actually bears an impact, because this actually feels like a family in mourning, but much like with his White Princess counterpart, the decisions he makes are from the prodding of either Catherine or Margaret. Even his death comes unceremoniously as he chokes on his own blood in the bath, and the episode is more focused on Margaret Beaufort covering up her dishonest dealings and pinning them on Edmund Dudley with the help of Thomas Boleyn, who just sticks his nose in everywhere he can. Yeah, that's all I got for this Henry. A guy whose mismanagement really showed how bad the writing could get. I've rarely seen a historical figure sold so short.
Oh, Henry Tudor! This way, John. So few miles across to England, yet so far away for us. If the king dies, Richard will have more power, and anything might happen to the country.
Richard has kept us both in exile all these years, but the time will come when we can fight him in the open.
Master John Caboto, we put some faith in what you say, but there is some expending too. We shall think on it.
I await your pleasure, and urge you to this most swiftly, Your Majesty.
Arthur?
No, Father. It is me, Henry.
Tell me, what is the most important thing to do when you are king? To be a really great king, you must secure the family line. A son.
These are the Henrys that appear briefly, although they still remain a significant plot device. Interestingly, their appearances come in the beginning, middle and end. Let's go backwards instead of chronologically, because you love to see me squirm over the ITV Henry VIII series. Joss Ackland played Henry VII on his deathbed at the start of the mini-series as a form of cold open, but also as a bookend for Henry VIII's eventual death scene. Henry VII looks a lot older than he actually was, and rather than an actual bedchamber, they show him dying in a bloody cathedral. And of course it's super dark, because why would you put the light on when your father is dying? Then again, that was probably King Henry's idea. I'll die in the dark, god damn it, anything to avoid adding a single farthing to the meter. Contextually and thematically, this scene is to set up why Henry VIII was so obsessed with his own legacy. His father expected much from him, perhaps too much. Young Henry was prepared to make war, make England rich, and marry Catherine. But when his father says, "Look you, boyo, nothing you do will make any difference unless you have a son." Okay, that Henry did not have a Welsh accent, but I really wanted an excuse to do one. And those words stay with the young Henry. Then, in his own death scene, we've come full circle, and Edward repeats the beliefs pushed onto him. But Henry decides to spare him from that pressure and tells him to follow his own conscience. In a way, Henry is breaking the cycle, but it also frees him from the ghost of his own father. In my tradition of finding obscure things when covering these historical figures, I have here a short film from Canada about John Cabot, or Giovanni Caboto, and his years-long endeavour to get Henry VII and his Privy Council to fund an expedition to the Americas. Henry is played by Powys Thomas. It's a pretty well executed film, and the pacing doesn't feel rushed, despite it only being 30 minutes long and the story carrying over several years. King Henry himself is rarely seen outside of his council chamber, and the story is as much about him taking a risk and breaking free from caution as it is about John Cabot hoping he can inspire faith in those who have the money to sponsor him. Henry's Lord Chamberlain regularly denounces Cabot, but ultimately has to admit that he was wrong when the news of Christopher Columbus's discoveries reached them. The lore of the New World is so great that even the thrifty Henry VII of England had to agree that the greater the risk, the greater the reward. And thirdly, there is the 1939 Tower of London film. I can't find any credit for Henry Tudor in the 1962 version, though I'm almost certain he is mentioned, or at least appears. Much like the Shakespeare play, Henry does not appear until it's quite late into the storyline. His exiled status is mentioned several times. He first appears following a time skip, watching the English Channel with John Wyatt, assuring him that their banishment won't be for much longer. They just need the right opportunity. Here, Henry is played by Ralph Forbes, or Rafe Forbes, or however you want to say it. Wyatt sneaks over the channel and steals the royal treasure, so Henry can fund his army. In essence, Henry is more of a narrative tool with which to motivate John Wyatt and Alice Barton into working against Richard. Elizabeth Woodville can't do anything in Sanctuary, and Henry is in exile, with a price on his head, so the other two are necessary in carrying out their plans. I have to apologise for these two. For one reason or another, they weren't available. Back in my Elizabeth of York video, I tried to find a movie from 2005 called The Princes in the Tower, but I couldn't find a decent, affordable copy due to it being so obscure. The story centres around the Perkin-Warbeck rebellion, with Henry and Elizabeth considering what this means for them if Warbeck is the real Richard of York. Back then, I couldn't afford the DVD, but now I can't find it anywhere, not even on Internet Archive. And Internet Archive are usually very helpful. The next is a little more regretful for me, as it does feature a much better Henry VII than what we have seen in a very long time. This was a short film called Tower of London, The Innocent, and it starred James Maxwell as Henry VII for the first time. The plot centred around, once again, Perkin-Warbeck and his imprisonment in the Tower of London. However, if Henry wants the Spanish alliance, neither Warbeck nor the Earl of Warwick can live. Thus, he has to rearrange the pieces on the board so he has a legitimate reason to execute them. There is an episode in The Shadow of the Tower which is just this verbatim, and Shadow was inspired by this short film. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the film anywhere, and I can't even find any images apart from the title card on IMDb, so I'm inclined to believe that this is lost media.
History has known many great liars, Copernicus, Goebbels, but there have been none quite so vile as the Tudor king Henry VII. It was he who rewrote history. Henry also claimed he won the Battle of Bosworth Field and killed Richard III.
Well, we're lucky King Richard turned out to be the forgiving sort. I'll deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, as well as slay more gazers than the basilisk ever would. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Huh? Tut was such a thing any farther off than that. I'll pluck it down.
These two are very comedic Henrys, but for different reasons. I've decided I can't not talk about Blackadder. The English timeline is messed around with, but you can excuse historical inaccuracy for comedic purposes so long as it's actually funny. So in the Blackadder timeline, Richard III never murdered the princes in the Tower, and the youngest Richard Duke of York married and had 2 sons.
So I suppose now you want to ravish me?
In a moment. The woman's insatiable.
In the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor actually lost, and Edmund ended up killing Richard III, making his father Richard IV. However, by the end of the series, thanks to Lord Percy and Baldric, the entire royal family gets accidentally poisoned and they die all at once, leaving Henry Tudor able to take the throne. The history as we know it today was actually a long detailed fabrication by Henry Tudor while he was in hiding. As the battle was lost, he persuaded Percy to help him with the promise of money and hid him in Edmund's bedroom. Edmund ended up recognising Henry through his portrait just as he escaped. Edmund gave chase, only to run into a trio of witches who tell him that he will be king one day. However, the witches soon realised they gave the prophecy to the wrong person.
I thought Henry Tudor would be better looking. More like that man who rode by just before.
Peter Benson played Henry Tudor in this episode. It was a chance for him to break typecast, as most of his roles were more similar to Henry VI's demeanour. And now we're back to Requiem of the Rose King. This was one of the weirdest creative choices in the anime, and that's saying a lot. He doesn't appear until the second half of the series. The identity of Richmond is kept a mystery until a certain jester arrives and starts stirring up trouble in the court after Richard becomes king. Rather than waiting around in exile, this Richmond is a theatre kid at heart, donning disguises and slipping in and out of rooms, spreading rumours, and leaving the princes in the Tower a bag of treats. So yeah, this version has Henry VII directly killing the princes in the Tower before he goes into temporary exile. Eat your heart out, Philippa Gregory. Honestly, considering that Richard keeps falling in love with guys named Henry, I'm surprised there wasn't a long arc of sexual tension between these two as well. In the Japanese dub, Henry was voiced by Akira Ishida, who has been a voice actor since 1989, being involved with such projects as Sailor Moon Super S, Naruto, Bleach and Yu-Gi-Oh! The English dub has him played by Brienne Oliver, who is a trans woman. Because the English dub has Richard voiced by a trans man, I wonder if this was an artistic choice too. Perhaps Richmond also has a secret regarding his gender, same as Richard. And I'm not the only person who thinks they sound like James from Team Rocket, am I? On the bright side, these two are entertaining in their own right, but make sure you acknowledge that line between fiction and reality, otherwise you won't be able to enjoy it.
So, here you are.
Yes, here I am, where you always meant me to be.
I hear you had a triumphant journey to London.
Yes, all the people seemed glad to see me.
Have you sent yet to the Princess Elizabeth?
To the Lady Elizabeth.
Lady Elizabeth.
Since her father was never truly king.
Oh, we must make arrangements for the wedding.
Not immediately. No one is going to say that I was not king until I married the Lady Elizabeth.
You are king already. You were proclaimed in France before we left.
And now I will be crowned in England.
Give them what I have given them. Years of peace and good government, and they say this must be paid for. They will hate you forever. So you see, since I do not wish to go to war, I have to be as economical as I can.
Well, young Lambert, you're for the chop. And the rib, and the fillet, and the shank. I'm going to give you a job cooking meat in the royal kitchens.
Oh, thank you, sir. Don't suppose you need someone to do veg?
Shut up, you.
The rest of these Henrys are the best ones you'll see. Let's start with horrible histories. Henry VII doesn't make an appearance in the original series until late into season 5. Most of the terrible Tudor sketches were about Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. The first sketch was a parody of Who Do You Think You Are? This is a series where famous people learn about their family trees. Here it's used as a framing device to explain the Lambert-Simnel rebellion, where Henry proves the real Earl of Warwick is alive, and foreshadow his eventual decision to execute him, as well as sparing Lambert-Simnel. Henry is played by Matthew Bainton, who shows both the bloodthirsty Tudor reputation, but also the cunning mind of Henry VII, a man who held all the cards all along. The next sketch is a song about Henry's reign, and how he's not as dull as he's made out to be. It's a parody of David Bowie, not the first of its kind in Horrible Histories, and also not the first to be performed by Matt Bainton. And then we have both The Six Wives of Henry VIII and its prequel series The Shadow of the Tower. I'll talk about Six Wives first because it came out first. John Woodnett played an uncannily accurate Henry VII, at least in terms of appearance, in the first episode. The first half hour of the episode surrounds the years in which Catherine of Aragon waited in poverty to be married to Prince Henry. King Henry has a grand total of 5 scenes in a trilogy of miniseries that stuck to historical authenticity. This is a Henry that makes use of what little screen time he is given. You also see his deteriorating health throughout, beginning as healthy and energetic, before gradually coming down with a violent cough and unable to raise his voice to the ambassador. It makes you want to see more of this kind of Henry, while also being grateful for the screen time you get with him. However, more of this kind of Henry, albeit played by a different actor, was granted to us when the prequel series was made. The Shadow of the Tower will always be the best and most intimate study of Henry VII, who is played by James Maxwell. Unlike Six Wives and Elizabeth R, the series is told in 13 hour-long episodes, as opposed to 6 90-minute episodes. While all but 3 are available on YouTube, you get a feeling that this series wanted to experiment with its medium, telling as much of Henry VII's story as possible and touching on subjects that were often forgotten about or overlooked. One of my favourite episodes is the 5th one, The Serpent and the Comforter, which deals with the subject of heresy as the condemned Lollard, played by Peter Jeffrey, becomes a figure of interest to both Henry and the assistant jailer, who feels sorry for him. It's treated as a small play, crediting Maxwell as just the king instead of Henry VII, but it has some insightful themes about faith and martyrdom, which will then carry over into Six Wives and Elizabeth R, if you want to watch the series chronologically. I have to confess, I have not been able to watch the series in its entirety, only the ones that are featured on YouTube, because the box set is really expensive. Episodes 9 to 11 are missing, and they are the ones that talk about the Cornish Rebellion and the Warbeck Rebellion. I had only watched the first few episodes when it came to covering Elizabeth of York due to the time constraints, so I had no idea that it actually overlapped timelines with the Six Wives in the final episode, and it actually features the death of Elizabeth. The series features the Tower of London as a main character as much as Henry VII. The two are inextricably linked. Henry is the titular shadow looming over his enemies, One after another have gone into the Tower and not come out alive. Or if they have come out alive, it's only up to Tower Hill where they will be executed. When Elizabeth dies in the Tower, true to history, Henry stops using it as a residence, wanting to be free of the shadow himself. I also like the relationship shown between Henry and his children, although Mary is rarely seen. He is mostly seen with Arthur, the one whom his hopes are rested in. He has high hopes for Margaret, and he is strict with Prince Henry, at one point practically saying, "Don't be horrid, Henry," when he makes fun of Dr. de Puebla. But more than anything, the relationship between Henry and Elizabeth is the best part of the series. If he is the shadow, she represents the light, and her death extinguishes it. The series doesn't end on a happy note. It shows a man, a grieving man, overwhelmed and tired, uncertain of the future, realising he is in a prison of his own making, eclipsed by his own shadow. While Henry VIII is infamous for executing people, even those closest to him, Henry VII seemed to be compelling because he knew when to spare the axe. However, that didn't make him any less cunning. There was no way that Henry would have held on to power so securely if he came in and purged everyone in the old regime. The best thing to do would be to offer mercy, so long as the nobles would bend their knee to him. But also, he needed to make sure that the nobles feared him a little, so they wouldn't be quick to rise against him. He punished those who disobeyed him through fines, but rewarded those who were loyal. He would only exercise capital punishment in extreme circumstances. Consider how Henry Tudor grew up, as opposed to the rest of his family. From an early age, people wanted him dead. He would be pursued throughout his life until he learned to fight back. Now he was in power, he was looking at things from the other side. Does he continue the cycle of bloodshed, or does he stick to the confines of the law, control the nobility, and act with restraint in order to show that things were going to be different? But don't you dare cross him. Much like spending money, Henry would only shed blood when it was necessary. There were people he couldn't let live in case they rose against him or stood in the way of a key alliance. Unlike Henry VIII, with his treatment of the Northerners in the Pilgrimage of Grace, Henry VII tended to only punish the leaders. In a way, his restraint was dark, because he appeared to only execute this power sparingly, no pun intended, meaning you wouldn't know how he would deal with you if you did cross him. The reason Henry VII doesn't appear as tyrannical as Henry VIII, who according to Wikipedia has the highest body count of the 5 Tudor monarchs, or Elizabeth I, who made hanging, drawing and quartering a regular spectacle at Tyburn, is because A, he knew bloodshed begot more bloodshed, and B, he wanted to move England into a state of modernity. Henry VIII grew up quite differently to his father. In a sense, he was scared of everything. Failure, disease, war, even his own family members. When he struck out, he hurt the innocent. When his father struck out, he was deliberate and precise. I wasn't sure where else I was going to put this. When it comes to the other kings and queens, there are other topics to talk about that dwarfs this hot take of mine. Putting it in a video about the first Tudor king feels like the most logical option. I believe there was a curse on the Tudor dynasty, not the one placed on them by Elizabeth Woodville, causing them to have no sons until the line dies out. No, I think the Tudors were cursed to continuously repeat history. Each Tudor who sat on the throne would be forced to execute someone close to them, no matter how reluctantly, for the sake of their own stability. They would also be unlucky in love. Henry VII might have been the luckiest, but he did lose Elizabeth of York to childbed fever. Think about it. Henry VII had to execute the Earl of Warwick, otherwise he couldn't make an alliance with Spain, which he very much needed as a king who won his throne by conquest and needed strong foreign alliances. The Earl had not done anything wrong himself per se, but he was nonetheless a threat, as the York loyalists would keep seeking to use him as a figurehead in the rebellion. Following this, Henry VIII's bad luck was as colossal as his stature. And that's not fatphobic, he was really, really tall. His misfortune in love was mostly his own fault, putting too much pressure on his wives to bear sons, and growing resentful when they didn't live up to his idea of them. But if Jane Seymour was the only one he truly loved, he was forced to watch her die. Despite being the most powerful man in England, he could not save her. As for reluctant executions, how many people did he send to the block for his own safety? He condemned friends and family, pushing away one person after another until he was left with only sycophants who were simply waiting for him to die at the end. I think his biggest regrets for those he condemned were Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More. Wolsey was lucky to have died on his way to the Tower. Edward VI executed both his uncles. One posed an actual threat, but the other was ousted because Edward was being manipulated by Northumberland. At the end of the day, they were his uncles, his only connection to the mother he never knew, and he simply never had the chance to fall in love, and spent the first years of his reign expecting to be married to the Queen of Scotland. But did he really want her? Mary I and Elizabeth I are overlapped very closely when it comes to reluctant executions. Both of them had a cousin, through their father's sister, who were too close to the throne for comfort. Mary had to condemn a 17-year-old to death, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Elizabeth did her best to keep her cousin alive, fighting all pressure to execute her until she had concrete proof that Mary of Scotland wanted her dead. Both sisters had to put their personal feelings aside to survive. Mary did it to marry a man who would abandon her and cause her to lose Calais. Elizabeth faced the consequences head-on, succeeded against the Spanish Armada, only to lose the one man she truly loved, the one man she might have married if she wasn't so afraid of matrimony. The Tudors were caught in a cycle of bad luck and misery. Elizabeth I broke that cycle only by dying with no heir. Turns out there was much more to say about Henry VII than I thought. The more I looked into the details of his life, the more I wanted to write it down and share it with you. I would like a future Henry portrayal along the lines of Shadow of the Tower one day. I think Benedict Cumberbatch would make a good fit for the role, although that would be ironic. Someone who can channel the energy and subtleties of James Maxwell. After such a hefty project as this, I'm going to move on to a smaller but related subject. Pun intended this time. I'm merging Henry VII's daughters into their own video, looking at their sparse portrayals on screen and trying to reason why they keep being ignored. And thank you for watching my video about Henry VII. I knew this was going to be a long video, and I did have fun making it, particularly in looking up the whole history of the House of Tudor. When I was writing the history segment, I managed to write 3,500 words in a single day, and then I just crashed. I thought this was going to be a nice quick video. It was very long, but I'm glad it was long because you guys really seem to be appreciating my videos and they're a source of comfort to you in these dark times that we live in right now. Next month, hopefully, we will see 3 videos come out. One about Margaret and Mary Tudor, the Wolf Hall retrospective, and a video about the most popular filming locations for Tudor dramas and what was filmed there. I hope you appreciate what I have to go through for you guys. It turns out between finishing the Jane Boleyn video and making the Henry VII video, I accidentally deleted the entire Gregory verse from my computer because I thought I was saving space, but the file got corrupted as I put it on a memory stick. So I've had to spend the past couple weeks watching the Gregory verse back to back as I capture the footage again. The whole thing. Don't make me watch The Spanish Princess Season 2 again. In the meantime, let me thank my patrons who support me in my endeavours. If you want to sign up and support the channel, you can sign up in the link in the description. And my King and Queen patrons I must thank are Alison Cuff, Anna from Gustine, Jill My Nero, Larissa and Leslie Williams. And if you like the video, make sure you subscribe and share it around, put a comment in there. Nice boost up the algorithm. I really hope this video does well because it will then give me incentive to cover Edward VI, followed by a video about Prince and the Pauper.